Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We are very excited to talk about inclusive leadership and prioritizing accessible environments. Next slide, please. Before we jump into today's conversation, we just want to share with you all University of Phoenix's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The University of Phoenix is committed to making higher education accessible to the working adult and has built a framework where inclusion practices have been organically embedded and are at the forefront of efforts. The university promotes this by providing resources to build cultural competency and career preparedness. Through community efforts, we build partnerships and create engagement that will provide resources and networks for our students and alumni. My name is Tondra Richardson. I'm a director in the Office of Educational Equity, and I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Saray.
Welcome, everyone. We are so delighted to have you all here on April, 20th? Yes, it's April 20th. We're almost halfway through the year, which is crazy. So thank you so much for making time to join us today. And before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the lands on which we are standing. So I would like to invite you to join me to honor and give gratitude to the Indigenous people who were the original custodians of the various lands we each call home. So we definitely recognize that this land acknowledgement alone is insufficient, yet it does serve as a starting point as we continue our individual journeys towards racial equity. So here in the Phoenix metropolitan area, we inhabit the Hohokam, Akimel-O'odham, Pipash, and Yavapai Island. Not islands, we're definitely in the desert, y'all. So Yavapai lands. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for taking the time to honor the original custodians of this land on which we stand. Next, we want to make sure we're raising awareness for the significant equity and diversity and inclusion milestones throughout history. We do acknowledge that some of the dates are missing and invite you to share in the chat if there's an observance missing aligned within the month of April. Please make sure to include details, maybe a link where we can all go and learn more about it. It is World Autism Awareness Day. It was on April 2nd, April 14th, National Day of Silence for LGBTQA+. So definitely take some time and let's learn together what are significant dates as far as when it comes to DEIB. What is it that we can do, and what is it that we can help others build awareness? April is Arab American Month. Thank you for highlighting that. If you can share a link as well, so we can go and learn a little bit more about the history of Arab Americans within the United States. Thank you. So May 2nd through the 4th, we are so excited to be hosting the second annual Inclusive Leadership Summit, and we encourage all of you to sign up. It is free, it's a virtual event, and we will have a lineup of incredible speakers focusing on social and emotional well-being, and how is it that we can create cultures of belonging. Let's learn about what are the systems that we are working in? What is it that we can do to address the various barriers? And how is it that we can hold each other accountable? So definitely join us there. We're excited, and we have awesome speakers joining us for each of those days. Look forward to seeing you there. Send it over to you, Tondra.
Thank you. And I also want to add, for those of you with us today, that our Day 3 keynote at the Inclusive Leadership Summit is going to have a specific focus on a discussion about invisible disabilities, accessibility challenges, and solutions. So we invite you to join us for that conversation. We have a dynamic, diverse panel lined up. So now let's go over a few rules of engagement. Listed here are the guidelines we believe essential to fostering respectful conversations. We value your participation in potentially uncomfortable discussions, as this reinforces our willingness to learn and grow. We encourage you to share your experiences and perspective in the chat box. We also ask that all participants contribute to an atmosphere of mutual respect and sensitivity. In addition, I noted in the chat earlier, connect with one another. Use this time to connect on these topics and others. Share your LinkedIn profile and helpful resources related to today's topic. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If time permits, we will reserve some time for questions at the end, but we want to make sure that we allow enough time for you all to hear from our dynamic panel of speakers today. Next slide. I am thrilled to introduce you to our moderator today, and not only because she's our boss, Kelly Herman. She is the Vice President of Accessibility, Equity, and Inclusion for the University of Phoenix. She's also an executive contributor to our President's Advisory Council on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Prior to joining the University of Phoenix, Kelly was the Director of Disability Services for SUNY Empire State College for 12 years and started her career in academic support and disability services at the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York in 2000. In 2009, she was appointed to the Instructional Materials Advisory Council in New York by then Governor David Patterson, and has been active in the Online Learning Consortium, WCET, and the Association on Higher Education and Disability, chairing the Special Interest Group on Online and Distance Education and the Standing Committee on Public Policy from 2009 to 2013. She also chairs the Accessibility Innovation Learning Network and the Accessibility Task Force for One EdTech, and was awarded the IMS Global Award for Higher Ed Leadership in 2020. Kelly has also served on the board of the National Diversity Council, on the Accessibility Advisory Board for McGraw-Hill, and is a data fellow in Anthology Education and Research Center. Without further ado, I welcome all of you and invite you and introduce you to our esteemed leader, Kelly Herman.
Thank you, Tandra. The pleasure of working with you and Saray and our entire team is definitely all mine. And gosh, I sound like I know what I'm talking about when you read that bio. So, you want to talk about, kicking it up a little bit here. I'm going to take a moment and ask my colleagues who are joining us on this panel to introduce themselves. But before I do that, I just want to kind of set a little bit of kind of a framework for how we talk about disability and what you're going to hear us talk about, today. There's a lot of conversation in the disability community. It's quite heterogeneous. So, that we all come from different walks of life and join the disability community at different stages of our lives and for different reasons. And, that then means that sometimes the ways that we all choose to talk about disability can be somewhat different. And for those of us who kind of grew up through, the 70s and the 80s and went to college in the 90s and especially went into helping professions, it was drilled into our heads through our academic programs that we needed to use person first language. And so you'll hear a lot of us talk about individuals with disabilities. And that's well and fine for a lot of members of the disability community, but others prefer identity first language, and they prefer to be referred to as disabled persons or autistic persons, and not to use the person first language construction. My stance as someone who has an invisible disability, myself a chronic medical condition, and as an advocate and an ally, and has done this work for almost 25 years, I switch back and forth. So you're going to hear me using both constructions as we talk and go through this conversation today. I think my colleagues who are joining us on the panel today also have different stances on this. And so just so you all are aware, we're aware of some of the language differences and what that means to the disability community. And if you haven't heard the differences, that's one of the reasons why I want to start before I even turn it over for my colleagues to introduce themselves, so that you can be aware and you can start to understand a little bit more about the community that we're going to talk about today. But before we get to all of that, I would like you to meet my esteemed panelists and colleagues who have joined us here today. So I'm going to start with Janet and ask her to introduce herself.
Hi, thanks, Kelly, so much. I am Janet Fukuda. I am the Accessibility and Usability Manager here at University of Phoenix. It's a new position, so I'm excited to take over for Rob Becker. My background was assistive technology. I started out in K-12 and moved on to running my own program in higher education and becoming an AT specialist for the state of Arizona. What I saw was I could give students the most sophisticated technology, but if the materials were not accessible, the equipment was not useful. So I made the move to go into accessibility, and I'm thrilled to be here today and introduce my next panelist, Dominique.
Thank you. Hello, so my name is Dominique. I am a benefits analyst at Serco. We are a government contractor. In my spare time, I am a master's student. I'm about to graduate with my master's in human resource management from Marymount University. I am an autistic person and I'm a disability rights advocate and neurodiversity evangelist. And most of my talkings today will be focused around the corporate world, but that can also easily be incorporated into the educational world. And next up is Miss Sam.
Sam, you're on mute. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dominique. At the outset, so I'm Sam Chandrasekhar from D2L. So at the outset, I want to thank Kelly and Robert for inviting me to this panel. I actually wear many hats across the industry, academia, and nonprofit, but my common passion across all those roles is inclusion, and specifically inclusion in education. So I'm the global accessibility lead at D2L. We offer a learning platform and other products and services to higher ed, K-12, and corporate entities and support them in delivering inclusive education. Prior to joining D2L, I taught and supervised research in inclusive design and critical disability studies programs for several years. And I continue to do that through adjunct positions in different universities, even today. And in the nonprofit side and the association side, I've been associated with the Inclusive Design Research Center in Toronto for over a decade now. And I'm with the IAAP, or the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, as a member of their Global Leadership Council, and also with several other entities. But let me stop there, and I look forward to this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, Dominique, and Janet. We really appreciate that you're willing to join us today. Just going to set the stage a little bit, for the conversation that's going to follow. I think, for those of us who are interested in, issues surrounding diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, I think sometimes we have a pretty good definition of what that means. And we think we understand, who the various, members are of the different communities. And what I've found through the 25 years that I've been doing this work is that when we start talking about disability as an aspect of diversity, people seem to get a little bit uncomfortable. And I think, there's a lot of reasons for that. There's, and we could spend 15 different webinar hours, kind of talking through, some of the ways in which that we view disability as a society. And I think sometimes we think about disability purely from a medical model, which is where we think about disability as something is wrong with a person. There's a disorder, there's an impairment, there's been an injury, something has happened that no longer allows that person's body to function in the way that someone else's body might function. And we don't necessarily see disability as an aspect of diversity, but it's so critical that we see disability as an aspect of diversity, because the one thing that we want to make sure that we highlight through our time here today is the intersectionality of all of the various identities that we have. The other thing that I think it's important to call out is that disability is the one category that we can all join at a moment's notice. And, certainly at the University of Phoenix, we see that with our adult students who may have come through their formal, schooling as a child and as an, maybe the first time they attempted college without having a need for accommodations. And then they come back to us and they've had an injury, they've been in an accident, they may have, acquired a chronic medical condition, and they now qualify and are eligible as a person with a disability. And all of a sudden, it kind of throws their world into a bit of a tailspin. And they're like, well, what do I do with this? And I think that's where you see a lot of the disconnect around the language of disability as well. And so I think it's critically important. Obviously my passion and, where I've spent my life's work has been in advocating for accessibility for individuals with disability. So it's really shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who knows me or has, worked with my team that we really feel very strongly that disability is an important aspect of diversity. And that, that's why we're doing this webinar today. That's why, our Inclusive Leadership Summit that's coming up has the theme that it does in the day 3 keynote, that Tandra and Saray hinted about. You're definitely going to want to check that out, because I think it's important for us to continue to have that conversation, especially around some of these topics that make people feel a little bit uncomfortable, because everyone doesn't want to be seen as the person who's kicking the person in a wheelchair, right? I don't want to do the wrong thing. I don't want to be offensive. But I don't know what the right thing is to do. I think I need to help, but how do I help? And, so we're going to talk through, today with some of those potential questions, that you might be having in your mind as we go through and, sharing some of the expertise from our panelists. But if you have questions, we would love for you to use the Q&A, feature in Zoom and be able to put those questions in so we can get to those at the end. But I want to start first. And Sam, I'm going to bring this one to you. We just talked a little bit about disability as diversity, why this is important. What are some things that we can do? How can we add accessibility to our DEI, initiatives at, our organizations?
Right. That's a wonderful question, Kelly. Partly because we do that in D2L and we have an idea around that, and partly due to my association with inclusive design, I'd really love to answer that. So the idea of human diversity is incomplete without including abilities. That's my opinion. And I think race, culture, and gender are more predominant in diversity and equity discourses because I think they've been politicized to a greater extent. I mean, I could be wrong, but this is what I think. And coming about how we can add accessibility to DEI, I believe that inclusive design is one of the ways of doing it, because inclusive design encompasses diversity, equity, and accessibility into the whole process of designing inclusively. Inclusive design is not just about designing products. It's a thought process, actually, that can be applied to the design of anything, products, services, processes, or even environments like we're talking about today. And I'm really privileged that for the past 17 years, I've been associated with my mentor, Dr. Yutha Trebranas, who practices and promotes inclusive design. So like I said before, inclusive design includes all human differences, like age, abilities, gender, race, culture, languages, name it. But how do we know who to include? Because we need to include or start including from the margins. So that's the reason why the first step in inclusive design is to recognize diversity. And that's how diversity comes into the picture. We know that diverse people have different needs, right? It could be disability-related needs, it could be anything, but they have needs. And the idea of a product or a service would be to meet those needs. But when different people have different needs, giving everyone the same thing does not help. That's equality. But if, say, 4 different people have 4 different body structures and you give them the same bicycle, only maybe one of those 4 may be able to ride comfortably. But if you give each one a bicycle that's customized to their need, then everybody can get on the road. That's how we can achieve equity. But there's a process. Where do we start? And that's where accessibility comes in. It's about starting with people who have the maximum constraints. So even while we create an environment for inclusive leadership, we need to start with people who have maximum constraints. There's magic there, because when you meet the needs of people with maximum constraints, you automatically meet the needs of other people who might have those constraints under, say, a temporary or situational conditions. They might also get met. All of you must have seen Microsoft's persona spectrum that has permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities illustrated. That's a beautiful thing to watch and to reflect upon. I'm talking so much about this because at D2L, we do inclusive design and we apply it to our product process. Like we intend to include, that's the inclusion part. And we engage in research to understand the diversity among the users. And we get the inputs, give it to the design. And design is where they try out different types of design or prototypes and try to get the most equitable options or choices. And the engineering is where accessibility is continued. It's kept all through, but accessibility is continued and like kind of it culminates in the engineering. And that's why we call it an IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and make accessibility a part of the DEI. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. And I think, what I love that you highlight there is, how, I talk a lot about it's so important to bake accessibility into our processes so that it becomes second nature, becomes, one of the things that we just expect to do. And, then we don't have to go back and touch a product again or a process again because we've already thought about it. And we, as you said, that's how you include, folks in making sure that you're including everyone as you're building, out the services and the programs that your organization has. So Dominique, I'm going to pivot here for a quick second, because I know you talked about in your intro, that you work on the corporate side, but I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what are some of the barriers that employees face when they are seeking accessibility or requesting accommodations.
Sure. So I'm here because I am technically two people. I am a benefits analyst and I oversee the ADA process, but I'm also here as a disabled person. So there's a few things that can get in the way of an employee initially seeking resources. Although the ADA process doesn't require disclosure to obtain accommodations, there's an overt fear of disclosure from wanting to report in the first place. Employees are often afraid that if they seek accommodations that their direct manager or their teammates or someone will discriminate against them for receiving special privileges, like perhaps remote work or a flexible schedule or additional items that could help them do their job better. There's a recent survey that showed that about 92% of companies that were selected for this survey said that they encouraged employees to disclose. But then with those same companies, less than 4% of them reported back that their employees actually ended up disclosing. So we can see based on that there's fear from discrimination, and it's very real. I have had employees forego the ADA process before because they're afraid that we would mark them in the system and they would be at risk for discrimination. And although I'd mentioned that, well, we don't do that and that retaliation is illegal, I've still had employees quit the process. And another issue that we run into in HR is that people sometimes don't view themselves as disabled despite meeting the legal definition of disability. The Job Accommodation Network, aka JAN, states that a disability is an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So that description alone is very vague. And what constitutes as a substantial disability is going to vary per person, because I think of disability as being on kind of a spectrum. Like everybody has different varying support needs based on their type of disability. You can't just look at somebody and determine, yes, that person is surely disabled because I said so. But most people view disability, like I said, in this very, very narrow black and white thinking of like you are or you aren't. There's people that have looked at me that have been like, nope, not her. And we're not really taking into consideration that 80% of disabilities are invisible and that all of us react, behave, all of that differently. Intersectionality is also another very important factor and component of disability. Many folks within minority backgrounds are less likely to disclose because there are levels to discrimination that they would go through. So women, including trans women and people of color, are more than likely to not be taken, or they think they will not be taken seriously or ignored, or worse. And that number is even higher for men and women of color or people with varying gender identities. And companies that also have a strict and unflexible policy and procedures type asset that actively work against employee flexibility can also be detrimental to employees seeking help. So in a perfect world, We wouldn't need the ADA for tasks for things like remote work or a bigger monitor, extra breaks, flexible schedule, or any other type of adjustment. But the reality is, in a lot of organizations, employees are required to go through the ADA process instead of the employer just granting that initial flexibility.
Dominique, I think that's so important, and you highlighted so many things that I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, I want to follow up on. And so for the brevity of time, because otherwise I'll dominate our conversation here today. I just one story that I like to share often about how sometimes the person's ability to see themselves as being eligible for accommodations and whether they feel like that disabled label fits them or not. I had the pleasure of being at a National Diversity, the National Disability Council event back in 2010 when it was the 20th anniversary of the signing of the ADA. And they had a panel, and the panel was comprised of individuals who had disabilities. And the first question that the moderator asked of the panel is, when did you realize that you had a disability? And they had people from all walks of life. There was a young girl on the panel who was born with her disability. There was someone who had an accident, and the last person on the panel was a staff sergeant in the Army. And he literally had surgery the week before to wire his jaw shut because of some of the injuries that he had sustained in serving our country. And he goes, honestly, about 5 minutes ago, when you asked that question, I don't see myself as a person with a disability. I'm just a busted up dude. And that to me has always stuck with me because I've spent most of my career working with adult students who have become busted up dudes in one way or another, either because they've acquired a medical condition or because they've, had an injury and then, have to now deal with accommodations. And, they don't want to necessarily have that label. There's so many concerns and fears, like you said, but it's truly their right to decide whether or not they want to pursue this. But I think there's so much that we can do, especially with the intersectionality, Dominique, as you mentioned, because there are lots of reasons why folks from underrepresented groups may not know that they have access to these rights, that these are protections that are in place for them and what accommodations could or could not do for them. And that's something that becomes really difficult for us to be able to figure out as allies and advocates and those who are working to help this population. How do we do that? And so, Sam, I'm going to turn to you because I think one of the things that you highlighted with your organization is that you want to cultivate a high trust organization, that where folks feel safe to disclose and feel safe to come forward and indicate, hey, I have a disability, I might need some accommodations. How do we do that? How do we leverage that trust and elevate and advocate for others as we do that in our organizations?
I don't know where to start, but I think I will start by saying that we believe that accessibility, whether it comes to products or to employees, people, it's not about just ticking the compliance box or the accommodations box. Because even if an organization wishes to support employees with disabilities and takes all the trouble to provide accommodations, that's not enough. Because accessibility is not merely about access, it's about participation and contribution as well. So it's about providing opportunities for everyone to participate and share their experiences, both in the workplace and outside of that. So at D2L, we have a dedicated team. They look after diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and that's headed by a person who's very passionate about inclusion. This team also includes accessibility into the fold. That's the most beautiful part. There is one part of the organization doing accessibility for products and stuff, but the employee part, they include accessibility into their portfolio. And this group brings out monthly DEIB newsletters, highlighting news within the company and beyond the company. They share the joys of different festivals from different cultures. They organize events like lunch and learns, talks, panels, and such. Autism Awareness Week, we had a internal panel of employees who shared their experiences. There are a lot of allies, and that makes it all the more beautiful. We have a number of employee resource groups, and there are groups supporting gender, race, and other diversity aspects, but we have one that supports accessibility in general, and we also have one for neurodiversity. These groups have dedicated Slack channels where conversations happen and steadily resources are shared. And the conversations help spread clarity about the issues. and also help generate empathy. And they are great places to go and learn about the lived experiences of people living with diverse conditions, human conditions. And like I said earlier, allies form the most beautiful part of these groups, because allyship is an important skill that D2L explicitly nurtures and supports. And these groups have senior leaders as sponsors, and panels usually are. How do I stop that? Gosh, did I lose the Zoom? Sorry.
No, we can still hear you.
Yeah, no, because I got a call.
Oh.
It was an internal Slack huddle call, which I cannot have any way of putting out through any focus setting. Okay, so I hope they don't call again. And so authentic leadership is something I wanted to talk about next. And this is exactly what it is, like coming across with all our vulnerabilities and demonstrating it's okay. That's what our leaders do. It's okay, we have issues, they say. So I was saying that panels are hosted by senior leadership sponsor these groups, right? So is that from me?
I'm not sure.
But it's nice. I like it. So long as it's not from me, it's fine. So these groups have sponsors, I said, and these senior leaders also. Should we do something about that, or can I just continue?
Saray and Tandra, I'm not sure if you could see on the back end if there's anyone else with some sound coming through.
We are checking.
Okay,
I
thank you.
tried stopping my mic, but it continues.
Yeah, I think, Sam, if you want to, continue and try to ignore it as best you can, just so we can
I
keep
will.
moving, that'd be great.
I will continue. My
Yeah.
voice is pretty soft, so I'll try to talk on top of it. So I was talking about authentic leadership because that's one thing that I've learned through my work at D2L. And I've experienced the kind of trust that builds across the organization. Because leading by example, being that authentic leader yourself, exposing your vulnerabilities and making it easy for others to make mistakes, that's very important. And even this same thing comes to exposing your differences as a human being and making it clear to everybody that we hold people on top of everything. People are the most important. That's very important for building trust as an organization. And this was very evident during COVID, when change and transformation in work processes were very important. We saw a phenomenal amount of effort by the company to make all employees, and particularly employees needing extra support, feel safe and be able to cope with changes. So one of the important things our CEO kept saying was, wear your oxygen masks first. And I always hold that for any occasion, including trying to not get burnt out myself. So I think I'll stop over here and ask you to continue, please.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. And I think, it's so important, I think, that we, start, thinking about intentionally how we need to, build inclusion into what it is that we do. And as you mentioned, Sam, inclusion for all. And, one of the things that we've done at the University of Phoenix, is to really be thinking about, how we take every step of our process and where we build and embed accessibility and consideration for individuals with disabilities into the process. And so one of the things, as I mentioned before, I talk a lot about, where we need to bake accessibility in and not necessarily bolt it on. And I use the example, I'm from, New York, and, if you go, through the streets of New York, you see old brownstones, buildings that were built long before 1990, and we had, any sort sort of architectural standards, for accessibility. And sometimes you'll come across a beautiful building and you just see an ugly ramp that's kind of tacked onto the side of the building. And one of the things that we're trying to avoid doing, as you include disability as an aspect of diversity, is to make sure that, as you design what it is that you're doing, that you're making it aesthetically pleasing as well as functional and accessible. And Janet, I'm going to turn to you next, because there's a concept that we talk about here at the university, and I would love for you to explain to our audience what this means when we say, what is the shift left? And if you could talk a little bit about that.
I can. Thanks so much. So I'm struck by what Sam talked about when she was addressing designing for inclusion. And Dominique mentioned building in flexibility. So web accessibility to me is the practice of designing and building websites that anyone can use, no matter what their disabilities are or what technology they use to access web information. So traditionally, accessibility was considered at the end of the process. It may have even been an afterthought. I think about Kelly's example of wheelchair ramps. They're ugly and they were expensive. And the one lesson we did learn from COVID is how quickly things change and how important accessibility is, and what an important role it plays in education or business in general. So organizations across the globe have started thinking about and adopting accessibility, perhaps due to lawsuits, or maybe they're responding to the moral obligation to provide equally accessible web solutions. Regardless, it makes sense to learn from the past and put the focus on building and validating accessible design, placing the needs on the individual first. So to answer your question, Kelly, the shift left is moving accessibility from the end of the process to the beginning of the process, where it really does belong. Consider a student enrolling in higher education math courses. In the past, the school or their vendor had to create course materials in an alternative format. Braille books are expensive. Usually they cost between $15,000 and $30,000 to produce. Plus, it's not unusual for these students to receive their books a chapter or two at a time. When I was in college, I purchased my textbooks. I had the opportunity to preview the book, or at the very least, skim through it. This opportunity is not always afforded to a student who needs materials in alternative formats. However, these are the students who would benefit most from previewing. Late or last minute materials versus timely delivery really shouldn't be a choice. I love automatic grocery store doors. It's universal design at its best. These doors work for everyone. They open and close for someone pushing a grocery cart or a baby stroller, or if you use a wheelchair or walker. They just work because they were designed that way. So if we consider the different ways people interact with the information that we want to share with them, via a screen reader, magnification, text-to-speech, if we consider those different methods of access and design for accessibility, then when someone with a disability joins our class, everything will just work for them. There's no need to remediate materials. There's no need for the student to wait for materials, and there's no outrageous expense. At the University of Phoenix, we're starting to take a more proactive approach towards the shift left in accessible design. Our instructional designers already keep accessibility in mind when creating master courses. In 2021, we began our Accessibility SME program, which was training volunteers from across the university in the principles of accessibility. The hope was that these people would become the go-to person for accessibility in their team. Well, this program hasn't been quite as dynamic as we planned. We're hoping to continue the work. This year, we've moved the process all the way to the left, to our webpage authors and designers. These individuals were taught about accessibility and began using a product called Acts for Designers, which is a tool for Figma where they can actually annotate for accessibility before it's handed off to the developers and engineers. Our goals include improved accessibility, less rework, and an increased speed to production. We started with simple annotations, headings and alt text, baby steps, but we can expand to more complex annotations as time goes by. So in a few minutes, I'll be sharing some practical tips that you can use to begin your own shift left, making your course materials more accessible for all your students and colleagues.
Great,
Thanks,
thank you. Thanks, Janet. And Dominique, I'm going to turn to you next, because I think, as Janet mentioned, the shift left, what we've been, trying to do at the university and building, accessibility into earlier parts of our development cycle. I think we have an opportunity there to be thinking about in our organizations, especially for folks who might be doing jobs like you do in terms of helping employees request accommodations and, reducing some of the barriers and how do we translate that shift left into, some of our processes and can create more equitable experiences in granting accessibility or accommodations in our organizations?
Sure. Well, the first thing you got to realize, disabled students become disabled employees. So they're going to end up at a company at some point. So all of this information will be useful. So like I'd mentioned in my previous answer, eliminating the need for the ADA in general for employees to gain accessibility and workplace adjustments or accommodations, whatever you want to call it, would make a dramatic beneficial change, and to also consider diversity equity from the start of the process. So we should already be thinking about, things that we can do before employees even get in the door, like how can we better assist people? So the other thing to think about is by dismantling problematic policies that prohibit employees from asking for their needs in the first place. That solves part one. So one of the professionals that I interviewed for my practicum thesis paper I had to do for my master's, his name is Doug Bletcher. He's the host of the Autism Stories podcast, which I was also featured on. He'd mentioned during the interview that I was doing with him that in the corporate world, there's this huge issue of trust versus control. And employees are merely asking for simple trust in their employers when they ask for things that would make them more productive. Employers and society kind of have an issue of wanting to control every aspect of our working lives. They decide where we work, they decide where we physically sit and what equipment we initially get. So if we ask for anything additional, companies are more concerned about dollar signs, even though in an ongoing survey from the Job Accommodation Network, Jan, again, they reported that 56% of accommodations cost $0. So the other latter half of that survey was that accommodations that did cost money, like the average cost was under $500. So it's pretty affordable generally, no matter what somebody asks for. The fight for remote work in general has been one of the biggest displays of trust versus control that we've seen recently. And I bring it up because a lot of disabled people need remote work, and we need it to continue. The New Jersey Institute of Technology had cited that remote work and flexible schedules are proven to decrease stress, increase productivity, and decrease turnover and absenteeism. I can personally attest to this, to all of those things. Being an autistic person, office environments overstimulate me very much, and they are extremely stressful for me to be in. People don't realize how loud they are, the smells that you can't control. The overhead lights are super bright, and there's always unannounced visitors that show up at your desk. Although they are nice, it's still unannounced, and it's something that I wasn't prepared for. And there's also general overall noise, like machines make noises, phones will ring at volumes that you don't like. It's things like that. So when I switched to remote work in 2020, all of a sudden, most of my sensory issues went away. My migraines didn't happen as frequently. I was calling out sick less, which before I was remote, I called out sick multiple times per month because I would become so overstimulated from just being in an office environment all day. I didn't want to wake up and say, oh my God, I have to do this again. So other than that, my productivity was way up. The stress of commuting and having to sit in that uncomfortable environment for 8 hours a day was greatly damaging to not only my mental health, but my physical health. So I feel like I'm generally healthier. My bosses now that I have are amazing and offer great flexibility. And I could have never dreamed of this type of flexibility in my early 20s. Giving people tools they need to succeed is always beneficial. Give people things, give people stuff, and good things will happen. Disclosure of my disability to my bosses was a personal choice, and in the end, it worked out for me, and I'm grateful. However, I know that not everyone is going to have the same circumstances that I do. Not everybody's going to be as lucky. It is pure luck, because most of the time, I've had jobs where I've had to explain that I'm autistic to my bosses. They don't get it, or they, give me that whole thing where they're just like, "Oh, you don't seem very autistic because you're not like my boss, my nephew's child, whatever," And then there's that questioning of disability again. So it's kind of terrible that there is inconsistency in disclosure, and people just have to essentially suss out their managers and their coworkers and even their HR teams before they can even consider disclosure. So there needs to be a change in policies and procedures to wrap it up, to offer more flexibility, to put more trust in employees. If people come to the ADA process and request things, chances are like 99% of people that request ADA accommodations are 100% serious about those accommodations that they request. Because there are people that I've spoken to where they're very suspicious of the things that people ask. And it's kind of, I don't like that, because we should really be putting more trust in people. And there is a huge lack of that in the corporate world. I'm sure students can feel the same way sometimes if they go into a disability office and maybe they feel like their voices aren't being heard. The disability office situations that I've been in the past, unfortunately, I have a condition called dyscalculia, which is kind of like math dyslexia. And I went to my disability office. I don't believe there is a test right now to determine if someone is dyscalculic. You just have to that has to be pointed out by your psychologist, which mine already did. But I went to the disability office and at one of my schools that I attended, and I, gave them that information, and they said, "Okay, well, you need to fill out this really specific paperwork." And I said, "I can't do that because I never took a test. I was just simply diagnosed." And they're like, "Oh, sorry, because you didn't follow this exact testing procedure, we can't give you accommodations." My math learning level, I'm at a 4th grade math learning level. I can't understand anything past division and very basic algebra. So bottom line, we need more trust in our employees and our students. People ask for things because they need them.
Dominique, I really appreciate, and there's a lot of comments in the chat, if you don't have it open, of people thanking you for sharing your story and, so many of your personal experiences. There's a bravery and a vulnerability, that you displayed in doing so. And we really appreciate that, because it makes for such a rich conversation as we talk about, as you so eloquently put it, the battle between trust and control. And as someone who's worked in disability services for 25 years and, have been in places where I kind of have been thrust into policies and procedures where it was you had to document every single test, every single step of the way, how somebody might have been diagnosed, and then it's a gatekeeping. It really there's no other word for that other than gatekeeping, because it goes beyond eligibility and saying, hey, what can we do as a reasonable accommodation, to more of a, I need to prove that you actually are entitled to this. And for me and my philosophy around disability services, that doesn't make a ton of sense. I'm not here to gatekeep. I'm here to remove barriers. And so I think the way that you phrased, your comments about how we can kind of shift left among our policies and our procedures, especially as things that are not, we're talking about technological development, but more that human nature of it, and the human element is so critically important, for us to be, thinking about and considering, because sometimes when the law gets involved, when we start talking about ADA, when we in higher ed, we talk about Section 504 of the Rehab Act, we then start saying, well, we have to make sure, it's legally laden. That becomes the driving factor, and it really shouldn't be. It should still be the people. And, as you said, if they're asking for it, they need it. And, being able to step up and to, express that disclosure, and then be able to, actually ask for that is such a huge sign of trust among the person on the person part. I'm sorry, I can't speak this afternoon, but on the person, who is actually asking for those accommodations, that we as service providers, whether we're in an organization, in an HR office like you are now, or like my team, with what we do with our accommodated students, we need to meet that trust, and we need to, be able to be able to show that we've earned that trust, and by working through the interactive process and the deliberative process. So thank you for sharing that. I want to turn things back over to Janet. She gave you a little bit of a teaser that she's going to share some practical steps and things that you can do to include more accessibility in your day-to-day practice. And just a quick reminder for our attendees, if you have questions for our panelists for once Janet has finished sharing these tips, please feel free to share those with us in the Q&A section. We would love to get to them. Janet?
So thanks for allowing this opportunity. I think that Dominique and Sam have given you wonderful information on the why we need to include everyone in the work that we're doing. We have a message, we have a job, we have something we want to share, but we don't always know who's receiving that information, what technology they need. So I wanted to share a little about things that make documents accessible. The first thing is headings. When we went to college, we all wrote papers. They had to have nice outlines. But how do we make headings accessible? Ancient history, when I learned to type on a real typewriter, we didn't really consider that a whole lot. But now we have computers. And originally people took normal text, that's what they call it, normal text, and they changed the way it looked. They made it bigger, they made it bold, they may change the color. So visually it looks different. And as a sighted person, I could look at a page or a report or a procedures manual and skim through those headings quickly and navigate as easily as I wanted to. Someone who requires assistive technology can't always do that. So the first tip I would give you is change the way you create headings. Do not just change how the font looks, but instead look at styles. The styles have built-in coding behind the scenes that we can't see, but assistive technology recognizes. So we want headings to start with the most important heading, the heading 1, and then progress on down the page. And then if you look at it, you can see a nice visual outline, but an individual, perhaps if they use a screen reader, can look at all the information and understand by heading levels what's the most important and so on from there. So create headings using styles. The next thing I would say is add alt text to your images. Not all images are just decorative. Some images have a meaning, even if that meaning is to convey emotion. You can easily add alt text, whether it's in Word or Google Docs, by clicking on the image and adding the alt text. Most word processing will give you the option to have alt text automatically added. I would recommend you add the alt text. Don't ever use the automatic alt text generator because it's a machine. It doesn't know what your purpose is in adding that alt text. Only you can do that. You are the best authority for the information that you want to share for that image. As an added benefit, if you're looking at a web page and the picture doesn't load, the alt text will load. So people can still get the information from the image that you included. Next would be descriptive links. I'm talking about web pages. There are times we want to include a link that says www something. Most likely if that document is going to be printed, you do want to have the URL there for individuals. But if we're going to do descriptive links on a web page, make them descriptive. We want to say, contact the University of Phoenix instead of contact www alphabet soup. That the link can be understood out of context. Imagine you're a screen reader user and you hear that www, you may not know where you're actually being sent. Some of those URLs are not descriptive. They don't make sense. But if we hyperlink the text, then everyone knows where they're being sent and what the final destination is. So that would be my third tip. The fourth tip is to use good color contrast. And there are lots of color contrast checkers out there. As someone who's getting older, I know that color contrast is really important. Sorry, my dog. Especially when it has to do with certain lighting situations, I need that contrast. So use a higher contrast in your documents. I believe that Tandra and Saray are going to be sending out some resources. So those resources include how to create everything I just mentioned and more. The last thing, and this is specific to Microsoft Office products, they have an accessibility checker. The accessibility checker highlights the problem areas in your documents, and it even tells you how to fix it. I love it because it does give that practical information on how to fix it, because sometimes something happens and it's like, I don't really know what to do. So use the accessibility checker if you're using Microsoft Office products. That's what I wanted to share, and thank you for that opportunity. I wanted you to walk away knowing why it's important, but some practical tips that you can take with you and start implementing in your everyday life. And that includes your emails starting today.
So Janet, before I let you come off and put your mute back on, we have one question in our Q&A, and it's from Marianne, and she'd like to know, what are the best color contrasts to use? So can you provide a little bit more information on that?
So color contrast, according to the web accessibility guidelines, is a ratio. So it's not necessarily using blue and yellow or black. It's a ratio for what the text color is and the background. And that ratio is 4.5 to 1. But just know, if it's a really good contrast, most likely it's going to meet guidelines. An accessibility contrast checker can look at it and tell you quickly what it is. So I apologize, it's not really answering your question, saying, that yellow and black are good colors, or some people need white text on a black background. It's very individual, but as long as you can maintain that contrast of 4.5, 4.1 to 5, then you are doing good.
Great.
Thanks
Thank you,
for
Janet.
asking.
Yeah, and there's a few things that are in the chat as well, some other resources that folks have pointed to. The one thing that I'm going to add to Janet's information about descriptive hyperlinks is, please do not use the words click here. Click here are not descriptive. We see it so often. And the one thing that you need to understand about someone who might be using a screen reader is that they might be skipping link to link. And if you don't use actual keywords to describe what the link is, and all you use is click here, and that becomes your link text, that person is just going to hear click here, click here. Well, they don't know where they're going. So make sure that you are, I think, for those of us who, use, the mouse to navigate the computer, we think about it, well, we're going to provide you with a direction, click here to go there. You don't want to do that. You want to, just actually hyperlink the actual keywords of the text. So usually when I talk about this with folks, I make people raise their right hand and promise never to do this again. I'm not going to do that for sake of time today, but you all have been through a workshop where I facilitated that. So you're kind of, required to uphold that and not use click here as your link text anymore. Just so you know, it's a condition. I'm going to actually turn it back over to Saray and Tandra after I say thank you to Dominique, to Sam, and to Janet for joining me today and sharing such amazing and incredible information. I really appreciate, your willingness to share your knowledge and your expertise and your talents with us. And, just judging by, the comments in the chat, I think, I can say it was a huge success. Folks, felt really good about the information that you were sharing. So thank you so much for doing that. And I'm not sure if it's Saray or Tandra, you're picking it up, but I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Kelly, Sam, Dominique, Janet. Oh my goodness, I learned so much, and I think there's so much more that we need to continue learning when it comes to making our even documents, making our teams and our cultures accessible to everyone. And it starts with small edits such as alternative text and images, and really being conscious and intentional about adding these additional ways of making sure that we're reaching everyone in the way that we need to. So thank you to each of you. Thank you to our incredible audience. And I just want to point out, in May, we will not be hosting a webinar because we are hoping to get all of you to attend the Inclusive Leadership Summit on May 2nd through the 4th. And again, you don't have to attend all days, but we would love for you to. And if you do, there's an opportunity to earn a couple of digital badges that you can display on your LinkedIn pages, and definitely develop your inclusive leader skills. So with that said, thank you so much, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you on May 2nd. Thank you.